And so I'm honored to introduce the Deputy Minister for Public Service Accessibility, Yazmine Laroche. We are honored to have an accessibility trailblazer here with us today. So she was appointed a Deputy Minister in August 2018, and Ms. Laroche has over 25 years of experience in the public policy, communications, strategic planning, and corporate management, having served on a variety of government departments, including Communication Canada, Canadian Heritage, the Canadian Information Office, the Privy Council Office, TBS, and most recently, Infrastructure Canada. Ms. Laroche is a Deputy Minister Chairperson for Federal Employees with Disabilities, and she's alumna of Carleton University and the past chair of the Board of Muscular Dystrophy Canada. And she has a critical task for about 300,000 members of Canada's public service. Yazmine is the champion for federal employees with disabilities, including people with vision loss and impairment. Her role is to show leadership to employers in Canada to create an enhanced accessibility workplace for Canadians with disabilities. So please join me in welcoming the Deputy Minister for Public Service Accessibility, Yazmine Laroche.
Special announcement coming.
I just wanted to point out for our people with vision loss that there's a Braille pamphlet at every table that would assist you. It's got the agenda on it and the information about all the panelists. So if you check at your table, hope it works. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Michael, for that lovely, lovely introduction. Je suis vraiment ravie d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. Ça fait toujours un plaisir de rencontrer des gens pour parler des enjeux reliés à l'accessibilité. I want to congratulate you for bringing together such a wonderful, diverse group of people and organizations to really drive forward the cause, which is really all about better inclusion and the enablement of people living with disability in our country. I think the work that you're doing here is so exciting. The reports are fascinating, and I know that they are going to lead to some really great results. I wanted to share my own personal connection with the topic of Vision 2020. My maternal grandmother lost her vision due to wet macular degeneration. And my own mother was diagnosed with the same thing 2 years ago. What's the difference between my grandmother losing her vision and my mother being diagnosed 2 years ago? My mother has access to a treatment. Every 2 months, she receives an anti-VEGF injection. And because she was diagnosed so early, because she got treatment when she was in her 50s, she started being monitored and tested because of her own mother's condition. She has actually suffered no vision loss. Does she like getting a needle in the eye every couple of months? No, but she is so thankful to have access to this treatment, which is preserving her vision. So what does this mean for those of us in the disability community and those who work with us? To me, it means that things are constantly changing. And we need to make sure that our policies, our legislative frameworks, and our regulations keep pace with all of this change that's happening. So in the next little while, I want to tell you about the advances that we're making in the federal government towards the full inclusion of people with disabilities in our society. And I want to emphasize as well the critical importance, the principle is, of nothing without us. And I'll come back to that. But first, Michael asked me to comment a little bit on the white papers that you're going to be discussing today. Overall, what came through for me in these papers is the passion that's driving your science, your research, and your investments. the underlying belief that I think one of the respondents to the research put it, that one day, quote, blindness will no longer exist. That's a very powerful expression of a goal. And those powerful and aspirational visions happen and they come to life because of the combined efforts of the people who are here, the advances in research, and the commitment and the drive to making it possible. The other thing that really struck me is how it built up from the community. And I think that's what makes it so rich, because it's not a hypothetical exercise. It's something that's deeply rooted in the experience of your community. And I want to congratulate you again for taking that approach, because it makes it that much more resonant and powerful. The unique perspective and lived experience always needs to be included in the development of anything that touches people living with disability. Otherwise, you really have to question its validity. We developed an accessibility strategy for the public service, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail later on. And we called it Nothing Without Us. We want to develop a workplace culture where employees with disabilities are involved in addressing the issues that affect them. And we want accessibility baked into all of our processes and our procedures. So again, I'm delighted to see the community coming together, these multiple communities coming together, to have all of the key players at the table to make the best informed recommendations in terms of policy development. That's really putting the principle of nothing without us into practice. So your 3 white papers, they're great reading. I really enjoyed them. I like the way that you focused on 3 discrete areas. So the whole issue of equitable access, the issue of what is it actually like to live with vision loss, and of course, what's so important, research. You highlight some of the complexities of trying to operate in a federation like Canada. People living with disabilities experience this all the time. You point out how challenging it is to ensure access to care is equitable for all Canadians. I'll give you a personal example. In my own case, there is now a treatment available for my disability. It's amazing. There's an actual treatment. And it has actually been proven to slow the progression, because this is a progressive disability, and it's shown to slow the progression or stop the progression, even for adults. And yet, even though this treatment has been approved by Health Canada, access to it is uneven across the country. So in some provinces, only children with the most severe form of this disability will have their treatment covered by their healthcare plan. But if you're lucky enough to live in Quebec, everybody with a diagnosis can receive the treatment, even people like me who are old. So how frustrating is it to think that your access to life-saving treatment depends on your postal code? And that is, in fact, the situation that many of us find ourselves in this country. In your wonderful paper entitled Vision Research, you highlight the amazing advancements in the research and treatment of vision loss, from CRISPR technology, which is so exciting, and optogenetics, and of course the promise of stem cell related research. These are truly exciting times. There is so much happening in the research community. There's been so many advances recently. But here too, we see the different perspectives and the tensions that come from the research community. And again, I'm on the board of Muscular Dystrophy Canada. We have very lively discussions about how we're investing in research. I know what it's like as a person living with a disability to balance the excitement, the glamour of investing in new treatments and drugs, searching for a cure, At the same time, we're very mindful that we want to be improving the lives of people today, now, so that they can live their lives to the fullest. And so, how do you find that appropriate balance between the future-driven research that is so critical, but the equally important investments in research to enhance quality of life right now? And I know that every community dealing with disability issues is having this conversation right now. Living life to the fullest is all about, of course, eliminating barriers. And your papers speak very eloquently to some of the barriers that people experience when they live with vision loss. Stigma and discrimination, and the effect that that has on access to education, to employment, to basic transportation. The paper also talks about the importance of public awareness in combating misconceptions about vision loss and the marginalization that results from those misconceptions. Again, as somebody who lives with a visible disability, I live with misconceptions all the time. The judgments that people make, even if they're not conscious, the assumptions that people make about what you can and what you cannot do, and how that affects you, and the way you have to kind of learn to cope and live with that. So it was really striking to me to see the parallels in your white papers and the challenges that we face right now in the public service. We did a comprehensive survey, a series of surveys of over 12,000 public servants living with disability. And what we heard the most of was issues around battling misconceptions, dealing with stigma, and the fear that people live with, particularly people who live with disabilities that are less visible and who are every day making a decision whether they're going to disclose or not, whether they're going to share or not, because of the fear of what might happen to them if they disclose. Is it going to affect my career? Are people going to judge me? Am I going to be stigmatized? So I wanted to, again, give kudos to all of you for reaching out to the entire community to gather input in these papers. And the goal of these papers was to convey the community's unique perspective on what it's like to live with vision loss and how best to support vision research and how to improve access and equity for vision healthcare in Canada, then I'd say that you've succeeded. Now, notwithstanding the challenges that you identify in your papers, and the challenges that many of us in this room experience on a daily basis, I do believe that these are times of optimism and opportunity for people dealing with vision loss, and I would add for Canadians with disabilities in general, and for all of those who advocate with us. I like to say that our time is now, because a lot has happened in the last few years with accessibility and inclusion moving to the top of the Government of Canada's agenda. So let me talk a little bit about that now. I know that thanks to a lot of really hard work by people, many of you in this room, just this past July, the Accessible Canada Act came into law, came into force. And I do believe that this legislation has the potential to profoundly and dramatically improve the lives of Canadians living with disability, because it's all about removing barriers to full participation. For the first time, it gives the Government of Canada the authority to work with stakeholders to create new accessibility standards and regulations. And these will apply to all federally regulated sectors, from banking to broadcasting to telecommunications, and of course, to the public service itself. And the government, when it introduced the legislation, it set a goal for us in the public service to become the most accessible and inclusive public service in the world. which is why my job was created, and which is why my Office for Public Service Accessibility was given the mandate of developing really the roadmap for the Canadian Public Service, the federal public service, to meet that really ambitious objective. Since the fall of 2018, we've been working really hard, first of all, to assess the current state of accessibility in the Canadian Public Service, to develop the strategy, and then to begin implementation. Our strategy was launched last May during National Accessibility Week, and it's called Nothing Without Us. Now, a lot of you know that at the heart of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, embedded in that convention is the principle of nothing about us without us. Well, our minister, Carla Qualtrough, challenged us to go beyond that. She said, that's not enough. We don't just include people when we're doing things that are all about them. In the recent Statistics Canada survey on disability, we now know that 22% of Canadians live with disability. So 22%, that's more than 1 in 5 Canadians. That means that pretty much every Canadian has in some way been affected by disability, either themselves, a family member, a neighbor, a friend, a colleague. And so we like to say, nothing without us, because everything is about us. Because we're everywhere. And if we're truly talking about eliminating barriers, then Canadians with disabilities need to be engaged in every level and aspect of Canadian life. Our strategy, and I mentioned the huge consultations and engagement that we did, it really came out of our engagement with public servants from coast to coast to coast. And we're focusing on 5 key areas. The first is improving the recruitment, the retention, and the promotion of persons with disabilities. The second is enhancing the accessibility of the built environment. The third is making information and communications technology usable by all. The fourth is equipping public servants so that they can actually design and deliver accessible programs and services to Canadians. And finally, and it's kind of the underpinning of the whole strategy, is building a culture of accessibility within the public service. It's a really ambitious strategy. We've set targets so that we can measure our progress, and it's kind of daunting. I don't know how many of you have experience with public service, either at the provincial level or at the federal level. We tend to be really good at designing policies and strategies, but I hear over and over again that we're not so great at implementation. And now we have this hugely ambitious strategy. And the day we tabled it, I said to my team, because it was like 6 months of frantic work, I said, you might think that we could tick the box and claim success. Well, no, this is actually just the beginning. Now we have to actually make it happen. And so that's my motto right now to guide our efforts. It's how do we make it real, and how do we make it easy for people to actually do the right thing? Last fall, I attended a conference put on by the International Labour Organization in Geneva. It was all about the future of work. And I was on a panel with private sector and public sector business leaders, and one of them said something that really struck me. She said, don't boil the ocean. You cannot accomplish everything in your strategy right away, so you really need to prioritize and sequence. So we've been spending a lot of time thinking about what are the critical pieces that we need to focus on right now that are going to give us the most momentum and give us the best results. So we are moving forward on our priorities for action. So, and I'd like to share those with you because we often talk about lofty visions and strategies, but I'd really like to share with you because it's kind of complementary to what you're doing here today. You've got your papers, and now you're going to want to focus on how do we take these papers and translate them into action. So I'd like to share with you how we're doing that in the public sector context. So with respect to the first goal, well, the government helped us a little bit on the first goal around employment because they set a very ambitious target. They said they wanted us to hire 5,000 new public servants with disability by 2025. That's 5 years from now. We know the human cost of not including people with disabilities. And again, the Statistics Canada survey that came out in 2018 on Canadians living with disability, it identified 645,000 people living with disability between the ages of 25 and 64 who are not currently in the workforce, but who have the skills, the education, and the desire to be part of the workforce. That represents the lost potential of a city about the size and population of Hamilton. Imagine. And we're an aging society in Canada. And we have this pool of people that we could tap into. So it really illustrates for me the criticality of targeted recruitment efforts. So what we're doing, the Public Service Commission, to its credit, has done some really good partnerships with universities across the country. And we now have a summer student program targeted to students with disabilities. Last year, my own office hired 2. And government-wide last year, it was the first full year of implementation. We hired 120 students. I'm hoping that we'll at least double that this year through our efforts. The Public Service Commission has also launched a federal internship program, which provides 2 years worth of support to Canadians living with disability who want to come into the public service. It's also completely revamped its assessment center, because we know that people face barriers from the very beginning. Even during the recruitment process, we build our processes in a way that will exclude people. So the Public Service Commission is revamping its assessment, all of its assessment tools, to try and weed out the bias that can be built into the way we actually assess people in terms of their suitability for work in the public service. But we know it's not enough to recruit. What I said to Minister Qualtrough after the government launched this ambitious target, I said, but Minister, what happens if we don't change the current experience of people living with disability in the public service? So we're going to hire 5,000 people by 2025, and 2 years later, they leave? Because right now, our recruitment rates in the public service, we recruit approximately 3% of our annual hires are people who self-identify as having a disability, but we lose twice as many. When we did our survey of public servants with disabilities, the biggest complaint we heard was about workplace accommodations. How do I get what I need so that I can make my best contribution in the workplace? We have a system that is incredibly complicated, that varies from department to department, that is very lengthy. It can take years to get the basic stuff you need so that you can be successful in your job. And that's why our strategy puts a huge focus on this. We created something called the Centralized Enabling Workplace Fund, and its whole purpose is to test innovative, scalable, replicable approaches to fix the process that currently isn't working for our employees. And first up is something called the Workplace Accommodation Passport. It is such a simple idea, and yet we think its potential is to be a huge game changer. It's premised on the tell us once approach. So you don't tell us what your disability is. You tell us what are the barriers you're facing in your job and what you need to get around those barriers. And this tool facilitates a conversation between the employee and their manager and results in a commitment by the manager on behalf of the public service to whatever it is that the employee needs. And this passport goes with the employee throughout their career. So it goes with them. Because right now, the situation in the public service is every time you change jobs, you have to relitigate for the adaptations that you need. Talk about stigma. Talk about, feeling harassed. Talk about feeling discriminated against. So we're hoping that this tool is going to be one of those keys to unlock some of the problems that people with disabilities currently face. We're also investing in a catalog of adaptive devices, the most commonly required adaptive devices, to make it easier for people to access them, and streamlining our procurement process. We're developing a centralized library of adaptive technology. And one of the projects, which I think is really cool, is a lighting project designed to test flicker-free LED lights in the workplace. And there's lots more to come. The second area is the built environment. We are the biggest landholder, I guess, or building occupier in Canada. And we know that access in our buildings varies again wildly. I work in a relatively new building, it's 5 years old. And when I started working in this building, I discovered that notwithstanding the fact that it was built to code, in quotations, it didn't actually work for me. There were all kinds of things that didn't work for me, and I'm not the only one. So one of the things that I'm so excited by is that Public Services and Procurement Canada is now, they got money in the last budget, and they're going to be doing an accessibility audit of a whole series of our facilities. But what's so cool is that, now I don't know if there are any engineers in the room, and I don't want to disparage the engineering profession, but the tendency is, if you're going to do that kind of an audit, you're going to let a big contract to some kind of big engineering firm, and they're going to come in and determine whether you are technically compliant. Well, we're taking a different approach. The new approach actually involves and includes people with lived experience as part of the audit process. That's huge. That's huge because, as we all know, many of us living with disability know that code is kind of the floor, and that code doesn't actually work for many of us. They're also going to be launching a procurement tool, again, to get easier access to firms who are going to help you in doing your own assessments of your facilities. And they've developed an accessible procurement center of expertise, because one of the challenges when you're a big, complex organization like the federal government, people don't know where to go. They don't know who to turn to. How do I do this? How do I start the process to procure stuff that's accessible? The third element is making information and communications technology usable by all. So a few years back, I was given a paper developed by an informal network of employees with vision loss. Their paper, well, it broke my heart. It spoke about how they were feeling increasingly excluded and marginalized in the workplace. Why? Because even though, as we know, technology can be incredibly enabling, somehow in the federal public service, it had had the opposite effect. Because somehow we decided to acquire and use technology without engagement and consultation, and without thinking about accessibility. So we ended up creating a situation where people with vision loss were feeling more marginalized and excluded than they had before the advent of great new technology. This is changing. We now have a policy that requires that all new government procurement is accessible. We also have a great organization that some of you may know about called the Accessibility, Accommodation, and Adaptive Computer Technology Program. It's a small program run out of Shared Services Canada, and it provides a huge range of services to help people with disabilities get the support that they need in the workplace. It provides equipment, it provides workaround, they offer courses, they do product testing. They're just an amazing group of people, and they're really helping. Another initiative under this goal is the new guideline on making information technology usable by all. So the government has signaled its intent that we are going to align with the harmonized European standard. And this directive provides recommendations for all government departments to take into account now when they're acquiring or developing IT solutions and equipment. I mentioned our fourth goal, because of course we're the public service. We serve the public. So the fourth goal is equipping public servants to design and deliver accessible programs and services. We've not really thought about that before, but again there, Service Canada, which is kind of our consolidated service center for a lot of government offerings, they've done a wave of surveys, and there too they discovered that people living with disability experience or report the worst levels of service being received from the government. Oh, my Siri has a British accent, and I don't know why he turned on. Let's see if he just goes away. So they are actually, they've developed an accessibility strategy for their service centers, for their service personnel, who are now receiving training on how to provide more accessible service to Canadians. And if you ever have a chance, for those of you who are based in Toronto or visiting Toronto, 4900 Yonge Street is their flagship service center. Complete redesign in the last year. And it was driven by an advisory committee made up of people representing a whole range of disabilities. And it is an amazing place to visit. What I love about it is, unlike a lot of places that you go to, you don't get pointed to, oh, there's the station in the back that's the accessible station, so you can go there. The entire facility is accessible, has been built from an accessibility perspective. So you just feel like it's accessible and open to everybody. We're also working with our Canada School of Public Service to develop training for public servants so that they understand when they're designing policies and programs. They understand better how do you take into account accessibility and disability considerations. The fifth, and I mentioned this, is the underpinning. It's about culture. How do you build an accessibility confident culture? Because too often what we find is people are afraid to even have a conversation because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. They don't want to insult you, so they'll ignore you. So how do you build a culture where people are actually comfortable having conversations about disability? Again, the Canada School of Public Service has a huge role to play there. And I'm so happy to say what they're doing, instead of saying, we're going to develop an Accessibility 101 course, they're baking in accessibility into all of their program offerings. So if you're going to take a course on project management, accessibility will be built right into it. If you're doing a course on financial management, accessibility will be built right into it. I think that's how you get culture change. It's we're mainstreaming it so that it's no longer an afterthought, but it's just part of how we do business. And that brings me to the second point of what I wanted to talk about with you today, which is nothing without us. It is at the core of everything that we do. By co-developing our strategy with people with disabilities, it gave us the confidence that we were identifying the right priorities. And it helped us to really focus on where we think we needed to go. I think there are parallels with respect to Nothing Without Us and the work that goes on in medical science and research professions. I spoke last year at a conference of physiatrists, and I talked about the frustration of being a person with a disability who so often felt that when I was engaging with the medical research and scientific community, that I was kind of an object, that I was the thing they were doing things for or to, but rarely with. And again, in my work in Muscular Dystrophy Canada, we see that a lot. We have a fight. I had a huge fight with our organization when we were redoing our vision and our strategy. And I kept finding language in our papers that referred to people living with neuromuscular disorders as patients. And it was just in referring to our broader client base. And I had a big fight with our CEO. And I said, I'm sorry, but our clients are not patients of our organization. Perhaps in a strictly medical setting, engaging with their physician, you could talk about a doctor-patient relationship. But we so quickly slip into that language of patient, which suggests that it's always about something that's wrong and something that must be fixed. And that is a very current conversation in the disability community right now. Are we broken? And are we something that needs to be fixed? Or are we just people with all kinds of potential who deal with barriers? And is it the barriers that need to be fixed? So I think it's so important, and that's why I'm so pleased to see the work that you've done here today, that you're engaging the people with lived experience. You cannot discuss research and treatment and even cure without fully involving the people you are working with and on behalf of. It is just so critical. What's also important is partnership more broadly. So you're bringing together a whole range of different organizations and stakeholders through this process. I would suggest that also within the disability community, we need to do more work together. And I was so happy to see the coalition that formed during the Accessible Canada legislation, because too often in the disability community, we pit ourselves against each other. Who's the most hard done by? My needs are greater than yours. My accessibility requirements are more important than yours. And as I have learned, just because you have a disability doesn't mean that you automatically understand the whole range and diversity that exists within disability. About 10 years ago, when I was an assistant deputy minister in executive policies and talent management, we developed an app which won an award, which you will find ironic perhaps. The award was called the Vision Award. We won a Vision Award for the most innovative piece of technology in human resources. So it was an app that allows people to talk about their goals and their ambitions, and it enables their managers to put in their input, facilitates a conversation. It was only after we'd launched this lovely app that a new employee of mine with vision loss pointed out to me that it didn't work with her screen reader. It had never even occurred to me to test the software with a range of users. It never even crossed my mind. That was 10 years ago. I can tell you that my thinking has changed. And if you want to learn more about this app, I will invite you to speak to the lovely lady right in front of me who's going to be speaking on a panel later on this morning, Luna Bengio, who will be speaking later about living with vision loss. And Luna is kind of my guiding star right now in terms of really paying attention to accessibility for people with vision loss, because I cannot begin to comprehend that reality. So I need to know from Luna what works and what doesn't work. And I encourage her always to speak up and tell me when things aren't working. So what does this say? I think what I want to say is engage as widely as you can. Check your assumptions at the door. Design for the extreme users. As the sign at Microsoft's Accessible Design Lab says, when you do not intentionally and deliberately include, you will unintentionally exclude. So in closing, let me just once again congratulate you for this wonderful event, for the amazing work that you're doing, for the ground-up way that you've built your papers. And I just want to tell you how inspiring I find this, and to encourage you to keep up the great work and hold us all to account. How can we collectively make a better Canada for all Canadians, especially those living with disability and with vision loss? Thank you very much. Merci.